Hello and welcome back to the third part for week 2 of the Node.js course at Hack Your Future. Now in this part, in the previous part, we talked about REST on an abstract level. Now to bring it down and tie it to web applications, first we have to talk a bit more about HTTP. As you know, HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's the main protocol that's used on the internet for the server to talk to the client. Now, last week we touched briefly about HTTP, and we talked how whenever you open a website in your browser, this sends a request to the server to get some data. The request contains the URL of the server that you're trying to get the data from. The response that comes back from the server contains the data that you want and a special header which is called the content type, which tells the client what kind of data that is, if it's an HTML or if it's an image or some other type of data. However, there are more things to HTTP, and I'm going to cover briefly the most important ones for now. So if we look at an HTTP address in here, so we have the URL in the HTTP address. Another thing that we have, which we have not covered, are, for example, query parameters. So at the end of the URL, behind a question mark, we can add URL parameters or query string parameters, which are then sent to the server, and based on these parameters, the server can make a choice about the type of data to give us. Also, you see here in the URL behind the host, there is a host is basically the address of the browser. There is also a path which is also used by the server to determine how to handle that request. Now we've covered this in Express a bit, where we have discussed the request handlers, and we said they are for a specific path in the URL. So okay, let me start writing down these things so that they then don't disappear. Okay, so HTTP. We're talking about HTTP. So we said we have a request and we have a response, and in the request there is the URL, and the URL has so that the host basically, that is www.example.com. Then there is a path which is this kind of slash, and then maybe something like lorem. I cannot come up with an example on the fly. And then maybe there is a query string at the end of that, which is always starts with a question mark and then foo equals bar, for example. Yeah. So that's all part of the URL that is going out in the request. Now, another important aspect to think about when talking about HTTP is what is called in the request, there is a thing called a request method. So that's the second important part here. So it's a request method. Now this is not part of the URL. This is sent in the backend. Whenever you type an address in the browser, it is always the same request method which is sent. To be able to send different request methods, then you need to use XML HTTP request or fetch or some other method of starting a HTTP request. I think you have already came across these HTTP methods. I have here a list from MDN about the HTTP request methods. Basically, these are verbs, which also are used by the server to determine what to do with the request. And there are more, but we will only use 5. And these are the most commonly used ones. That is get, that is post, put, delete, and patch. Now we will discuss when these methods are used in the future. For now, just remember that there are these 5 request methods. And again, whenever you type something in the address bar of the browser, by default, it's always the GET request that's being used. So the request methods is get, post, put, delete, and patch. That's the, oh, sorry, I moved away the browser. Here is the Wikipedia page for HTTP. So we have a request message. Now, we have the request method. And what's really a bit interesting is the request can also have, in addition to the query strings, can also have request headers. Now, I cannot think of a good example for this, but just keep in mind that the request, or every request, has can have one or more headers attached to it, and this is also can be processed by the browser. Oh, I just remembered of example. So the headers are commonly used for all kinds of authentication and things like that. And then in addition to the header, there is also a request body, and there is a body always except for GET requests from the 5 that we've written above. So a GET request has no body, but the post, put, delete, patch, they all have a body, and the body can be used to send also additional data. And usually this data is bigger than what you can send in a query string. The query string is limited. I don't know exactly how much, but it's limited. And in the body, you can send potentially megabytes of data to the server. For example, if you're uploading a file or something like that, that might be the use for the request body. Um, what else? So that's about I think that's everything for the request side. Now let's look at the response side. So on the response side, when the server processes the request, again, we have a response headers. And here I already said one important header. If you're thinking content type, then you're right. So there is a content type header, which we will use a lot. There is the response body, which is just text, right? But this text can be HTML, CSS, JavaScript, JSON, and so forth. It can also be binary to send data or images, for example. And then one last part, which is also very important, is the response status. And this is, does anybody know what the response status is? So this is a 3-digit number, which basically tells us what happened. And I just pasted this from Wikipedia. So this is a 3-digit number, and they're grouped in some categories. So if it starts with 1 and then some 2 other digits, this is just some information. This we will not use that often. If it's 2 and some numbers like 200, 201, then this generally means that this was a successful request. So the request was successfully handled and the response is successfully sent back and everything is looking good. A special case, and we will not use this when writing web applications, but this is used commonly, is if you go to a certain URL and then the server has moved to another URL, then you might get a redirect which will send you to the new address. And this is usually 301, which is permanent, and 300, I don't know, 7 or something, which is temporarily moved to another address. Another category is for something like 400, 401, and so for 404, maybe you have you know. And this basically means there was an error, but the error was made by the client when he made the request. So when the client made a request, he either used the wrong path or the wrong query string or the wrong format of the method or the wrong headers or something that the client put in the request was not correct or was not what the server could handle. And in that case, you get a client error. And this means 400 or 400 something. And finally, if the request was all right, but the server for some unexpected reason failed to respond with a successfully, then you get a server error, and this is usually 500 something, so 501 and so forth. Now you don't have to remember all of this. As I said, the most important ones is probably 200 and 201, and then some of the client's error like 400 and the server error which is 500. And if you have trouble remembering this, there is this great website where they're all explained with docs. So here is the website. It's HTTP status docs. So 200 is okay, 201 is created, and all the 200s are usually something really good. 301 is a permanent redirect. 307 is a temporary redirect. Then 400 is a pretty generic client error which just says bad request. 404 you have probably seen means not found, and so forth. And I'm looking for the 500 now. 500 just says internal error, so no details, but something went wrong on the side of the server. So these are the most important status codes that you need to keep in mind. And all of this information you need to be able to reason about so that you can write good web applications, because to write a web application you need to uh, make use of all the data that comes in with the request and then be able to set all the important information in the response. So the response is not just the actual data, but it's also the headers and the status. And now to connect, I'm thinking if there is enough time to go with the next part, and if there is an exercise here. Okay, before we continue, we'll do a short exercise. So I'm going to show you a screenshot of developer console, and I want to ask you to identify all the different things that we talked about here, to identify them in this screenshot from the developer console from a real HTTP request. So go ahead. Okay, so let's do it now together. I hope you are done. So we have the URL is here at the top. Now HTTPS is just saying that what type of protocol is used. S stands for, I think, for secure protocol. So this is a secure protocol. StackOverflow.com is the host. So that's the address of the server. Everything after this slash is the path. So this is the path, the URL path that is used to track down the question that you're trying to open. Here is the request method, which says get. And that's because I opened this by typing an address in the browser. The status of the response that came back from the server is 200. That means everything is good. Now here it's a bit mixed, but let's go first to the request headers. Yeah, okay, so for example in the request header, I forgot, but there is all the cookies are being sent in the request headers. And for example, what kind of language the user prefers, it will be sent in the request header. In the response, so there will be obviously the HTML for this thing. You can see that here because it's content type text HTML. So it's sending back in HTML, but there are some additional headers, for example, how big is the HTML, and also optionally there is also encoding, so the HTML is being zipped before being sent to save on bandwidth. So this can all be handled by the browser. It understands that when this thing is zipped, it needs to do an unzip, and the server understands the request and can process the path and the cookies to check, to find the right question in the database and put that in HTML and send it back. And also understands the language to make sure that the language also matches for what the browser has requested from it. Okay, well, I think we'll stop here. So this was a quick overview over HTTP and all the different concepts that we have in it. And in the next part, we're going to bring together all this information about HTTP and what we talked about REST on a high level and bring them together in one part.